Mary Wells's voice in 1964 was one of the purest, most controlled instruments in popular music. When she sang My Guy, every note was precise, effortless, confident. The voice that made her Motown's first major female star was technically perfect. Pitch control, breath support, emotional delivery, all working in harmony. And then, sometime in the 1970s, that voice started to change, started to sound strained, started to lose the effortless quality that it made Mary special. By the 1980s, people who loved Mary's voice noticed something was wrong. By the 1990s, Mary Wells was dying of throat cancer. And the question that haunts her story is, when did the cancer start? And how much of Mary's vocal decline in the 1970s was the disease already destroying her voice? Some of y'all remember noticing Mary's voice didn't sound the same in the 1970s. Remember hearing her perform and thinking the smoothness was gone, the ease was missing, something fundamental had changed. Remember wondering if it was age, technique problems, or damage from performing. Remember not knowing Mary might have been fighting throat cancer for years before diagnosis. Remember that moment when you heard Mary had cancer and thought back to all those years when her voice had been struggling and realized the disease might have been there all along. Mary Wells left Motown in 1964 at the peak of her vocal abilities. The decision destroyed her career, but her voice was still magnificent. Through the late 1960s, Mary could still sing beautifully, even if the hits had stopped coming. But by the early 1970s, people close to Mary noticed changes. The voice was rougher, higher notes were harder, sustaining phrases required more visible effort. Mary was in her early 30s, too young for age-related vocal decline. Something else was happening. The 1970s entertainment industry didn't accommodate vocal struggles. If you couldn't deliver, you didn't work. Mary needed to keep performing to survive financially, needed to sound like the Mary Wells audiences remembered. So Mary pushed through whatever was happening to her voice, performed when it hurt, sang when notes didn't come easily anymore, accepted whatever booking she could get even when her voice wasn't cooperating. The alternative was admitting something was wrong, seeking medical help she couldn't afford, and risking her career ending completely. Some of y'all understand what it means to hide a medical condition, because acknowledging it would cost you your livelihood. Understand performing through pain, because stopping means losing income. Understand that Mary Wells probably knew something was wrong with her throat for years before she could afford to find out what. The American healthcare system in the 1970s and 1980s was brutal for working performers without health insurance. Mary had no insurance, had no safety net, had to choose between her voice and her survival. And for years, survival meant pretending her voice was fine. The vocal decline accelerated through the 1970s and 80s. Mary's live performances became increasingly difficult to watch for people who remembered her prime. The voice that had been so controlled was now unpredictable. Notes that should have been easy were strained. The effortless quality that had defined Mary Wells was gone. And Mary kept performing because she had to. Mary Wells was diagnosed with throat cancer in the early 1990s. By the time doctors identified it, the cancer was advanced, had been growing for years, possibly decades. The diagnosis came too late for early intervention that might have saved Mary's life. But the diagnosis also explained everything. Explained the vocal changes in the 1970s, explained the struggles in the 1980s, explained why Mary's voice had been deteriorating for 20 years. The cancer had been killing Mary's voice long before it killed Mary. Throat cancer in singers is particularly cruel. The disease attacks the instrument defining their identity and livelihood. Every attempt to use the voice accelerates the damage. Mary had been unknowingly destroying her throat for years while trying to maintain a career that required her voice to sound like 1964. The tragic irony, singing to survive financially made the cancer worse. Some of y'all remember when Mary's cancer diagnosis became public. Remember the shock of learning that Mary Wells, who'd been Motown's first major female star, was dying without health insurance, without resources, without the kind of support that Diana Ross enjoyed. Remember Berry Gordy sending money, but not enough. Remember the music industry rallying, but too late. Remember understanding that Mary's poverty had prevented early diagnosis that might have saved her life. Treating throat cancer in the early 1990s was enormously expensive. Surgery, radiation, chemotherapy all required insurance or wealth Mary didn't have. Mary had spent the 1980s struggling financially, playing small venues for small money, living without the kind of security that would have allowed her to seek medical care when her voice first started changing. By the time Mary could no longer hide that something was seriously wrong, the cancer had progressed beyond what medicine could fix. Mary's final years were brutal. The cancer destroyed her ability to speak, swallow, do basic things most people take for granted. The voice that made Mary famous was gone. The throat that had produced My Guy was consumed by disease. Mary spent her last months unable to communicate verbally, unable to eat normally, suffering through treatments that prolonged life but couldn't restore what the cancer had taken. And through all of it, Mary had to accept charity from an industry that had used her and discarded her decades earlier. Berry Gordy's contribution to Mary's medical expenses was reported as $50,000, generous by some measures, completely inadequate by others. Berry had made millions from Mary's voice, had built Motown's foundation partly on Mary's success, had used Mary to prove his vision worked, and then let Mary struggle for 30 years after she left. $50,000 toward medical bills that would eventually exceed $500,000 was Berry acknowledging obligation while avoiding actual responsibility. Mary needed ongoing support. Berry sent a one-time check. Diana Ross's response to Mary's illness was public silence. No benefit concert, no major financial contribution that made headlines, no use of Diana's platform to rally support for the woman whose success had helped make Diana's career possible. Diana's silence echoed her silence during Florence Ballett's struggles and death. The pattern was clear. Diana didn't acknowledge the women who came before her or competed with her even when they were dying, even when acknowledgement could have helped. The music community rallied more than Motown. Rod Stewart organized benefit concerts. Bruce Springsteen contributed. The Rhythm and Blues Foundation provided support. Strangers who remembered Mary's music sent money. The outpouring revealed how much Mary had meant to people who'd grown up with her voice. But the outpouring also revealed how completely the music industry had failed Mary. She shouldn't have needed charity. She should have had royalties that made her wealthy, should have had health care that caught the cancer early, should have had support systems that prevented her dying in poverty. Mary Wells died on July 26, 1992, at age 49. Throat cancer killed the voice that had made Motown legitimate, killed the woman who'd proven Berry Gordy's vision could work commercially, killed Motown's first major female star in a way that felt cosmically unfair, taking the very instrument that had made Mary special. 49 years old, should have had decades ahead of her, should have been living comfortably off My Guy royalties, should have had health insurance that caught the cancer when it was treatable. Instead, Mary died broke and in pain, another Motown casualty. Some of y'all attended Mary's funeral or watched coverage. Remember the tributes from people who'd loved her music. Remember the absence of Berry Gordy and Diana Ross. Remember thinking about how different Mary's life could have been if the industry had valued her properly. Remember feeling angry that someone who'd given so much to music died with so little. Remember that anger being justified because Mary's poverty and death were preventable. The medical question haunting Mary's story is when the cancer started. If Mary's vocal changes in the 1970s were early symptoms, she'd been living with throat cancer 20 years before diagnosis. 20 years of the disease slowly destroying her voice while Mary had no way to know what was happening. 20 years when early detection could have meant survival. 20 years when healthcare access could have changed everything. But Mary had no insurance, no regular medical care, no reason to see doctors who might have caught it early. Smoking likely contributed to Mary's throat cancer. Mary was a smoker, and smoking is a major risk factor for throat cancer. But smoking alone doesn't explain why Mary's voice changed so earlier than the diagnosis. Doesn't explain the 20-year decline. Doesn't explain why someone in their early 30s started experiencing vocal difficulties that got progressively worse. The cancer was probably growing long before anyone knew to look for it. And every year without diagnosis was another year the cancer spread. The entertainment industry's complicity in Mary's death deserves examination. The industry knew Mary was struggling financially, knew Mary was performing without health insurance, knew Mary's voice was deteriorating, and the industry did nothing until Mary was dying. No intervention when Mary left Motown and struggled, no support system when Mary's voice started failing, no healthcare access when early detection could have saved her. The industry watched Mary Wells decline for decades and only responded when it was too late to matter. Berry Gordy's responsibility for Mary's fate extends beyond the contract dispute that led to her leaving Motown, extends beyond the $50,000 check during her final illness. Berry built a fortune on Mary's talent and My Guy, used Mary's success to establish Motown's credibility, and when Mary needed support, when Mary was literally dying from a disease that had been destroying her voice for years, Berry's response was minimal. The disparity between what Berry took from Mary and gave back reveals how Motown treated the artists who made its success possible. Diana Ross's legacy includes the silence during Mary's final illness, includes never publicly acknowledging that Mary's success had helped pave the way for Diana's career, includes never using Diana's wealth or platform to help when help was desperately needed. Diana could have organized a major benefit concert, could have made a substantial financial contribution, could have used her fame to bring attention to Mary's situation. Diana did none of those things, and that silence is part of Diana's story, whether Diana acknowledges it or not. Mary Wells's voice in 1964 represents what could have been, represents the pure talent that should have led to a long celebrated career, represents the instrument that proved Berry Gordy's vision worked before anyone else at Motown achieved that level of success. And Mary's voice in 1992, destroyed by cancer, silenced forever, represents what actually happened, represents the waste of extraordinary talent, represents the human cost of an industry that uses artists and discards them. Some of y'all have never forgotten Mary Wells's voice, have kept playing My Guy and Two Lovers, remembering when Mary was at the top, have felt the tragedy of Mary's death every time you hear her sing, have understood that Mary deserved better than what Berry Gordy gave her, better than what the music industry gave her, better than what life gave her. That understanding matters. That memory keeps Mary's story honest instead of letting it be sanitized. The question haunting every discussion of Mary Wells is what her life would have been if she'd stayed at Motown and Berry had renegotiated her contract fairly. If Mary had continued getting the promotional support, the best songs, the resources that made Motown artists successful. Would Mary have had the health care that caught the cancer early? Would Mary have had the wealth that made her final years comfortable? Would Mary's voice have lasted longer without the stress of poverty and struggle? the alternate history feels tragically close. Berry Gordy's legacy includes Mary dying of throat cancer at 49 without adequate health care, includes making millions from Mary's voice and contributing $50,000 toward her final medical bills, includes using Mary to prove Motown could work and then letting Mary struggle for 30 years, includes building an empire partly on Mary's talent and never ensuring Mary benefited proportionally from that empire. Those facts should be taught alongside every celebration of Motown's success. The music industry's legacy includes Mary Wells as an example of how artists are treated when their commercial value ends. Includes watching Mary's voice deteriorate for 20 years and only responding when she was dying. Includes a system where someone who'd had a #1 hit in 1964 died broke in 1992. Includes the reality that talent and contribution don't guarantee security or care. Mary's death was preventable, but the industry chose otherwise. Mary Wells deserved to live into old age, deserved to see her voice celebrated for decades, deserved to have wealth that reflected her contributions to Motown's success, deserved health care that caught the cancer early and treated it effectively, deserved to be honored by Berry Gordy and Diana Ross and everyone who benefited from what Mary built. She deserved all of that. She got none of it. And that injustice defines her legacy as much as her beautiful voice does. The music industry's legacy includes Mary Wells as an example of how artists are treated when their commercial value ends. Includes watching Mary's voice deteriorate for 20 years and only responding when she was dying. Includes a system where someone who'd had a #1 hit in 1964 died broke in 1992. Includes the reality that talent and contribution don't guarantee security or care. Mary's death was preventable, but the industry chose otherwise. Do you remember noticing Mary's voice sounding different in the 1970s? Did you know she was fighting throat cancer for potentially 20 years before diagnosis? Drop a comment sharing your memories of Mary's voice, or tell us about other artists whose medical struggles the industry ignored. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another trip down memory lane.